You are listening to Neuroscience Persuasion Tactics by Lumen Audiobooks. Influence without pressure. Subscribe for more. Prologue. The ethical advantage. The business world has taught you to push for the close, overcome objections, and break through resistance. This approach works in the short term, but it creates a hidden cost that shows up months later when deals fall apart, clients ghost, and relationships sour. Neuroscience reveals why this happens and offers a better way. Traditional sales training focuses on controlling the conversation, but the human brain interprets control as threat. When people feel cornered or manipulated, their survival systems activate, creating defensiveness that blocks learning and decision-making. The research shows that people buy from those they trust, and trust dies the moment they sense manipulation. This book changes the game by using neuroscience to create influence without pressure. The ethical advantage comes from understanding how the brain processes information, makes decisions, and builds relationships. When you know what happens inside someone's head when they hear your pitch, you can speak their language instead of fighting their biology. This doesn't mean becoming a Jedi mind trick master. It means crafting messages that align with how people naturally think and feel. Consider what happens when someone hears a high-pressure sales pitch. Their heart rate increases, blood flow shifts away from the prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala sounds alarm bells. In this state, complex thinking becomes nearly impossible. They can't properly evaluate your solution because their brain is focused on escape rather than engagement. The harder you push, the more their brain treats you as a threat to avoid. Contrast this with what happens when someone feels psychologically safe during a conversation. Their nervous system stays calm, their thinking remains clear, and they're actually able to process the value you're offering. They feel curious rather than resistant, open to learning instead of defending. This creates the perfect conditions for genuine persuasion that leads to confident decisions and satisfied customers. The science behind ethical influence isn't complicated, but it's often counterintuitive. You might think being more aggressive with your claims builds credibility, but neuroscience shows that too much certainty triggers skepticism. You might believe sharing every feature will help your cause, but too much information overloads working memory and reduces comprehension. Understanding these patterns lets you structure conversations that work with human biology instead of against it. Each chapter in this book translates laboratory findings into practical language patterns you can use immediately. You'll learn priming techniques that prepare minds to receive your message, threat reduction methods that calm defensiveness, and memory strategies that make your key point stick. These aren't psychological tricks designed to manipulate. They're evidence-based communication tools that respect autonomy while guiding toward better decisions. The approach works because it honors how people actually make choices. Research shows that most purchasing decisions happen unconsciously. Then people rationalize those decisions with logical reasons afterward. When you understand this process, you can craft messages that speak to the unconscious mind first, then provide the concrete information that satisfies conscious reasoning. This creates alignment between intuition and analysis, leading to decisions that feel both right and logical. The ethical dimension matters because manipulation creates temporary wins but permanent damage. When people realize they've been psychologically maneuvered into a decision, they experience something researchers call post-decision dissonance. This unpleasant feeling makes them question their choice and often leads to buyer remorse, canceled orders, or damaged relationships. Ethical influence creates the opposite effect because people feel good about decisions they made freely. This doesn't mean being passive or soft on outcomes. The goal remains converting more prospects, closing more deals, and building stronger relationships. The difference is in the process you use to get there. You're not abandoning results. You're achieving them through methods that actually strengthen rather than weaken the foundation your business depends on. The book begins with foundational concepts about how brains process information under pressure, then moves into specific language patterns for different parts of the sales process. You'll learn scripts for cold calls, demo presentations, objection handling, and closing conversations. Each technique includes the neuroscience explanation behind why it works, so you understand not just what to say, but why it influences behavior. The final chapters focus on integration, showing how to combine multiple techniques into natural conversation flow. You'll also explore ethical boundaries and consent protection, because influence without integrity destroys the trust that makes influence possible. The goal is sustainable business relationships that generate referrals, repeat business, and long-term success. Consider how this approach changes daily conversations. Instead of fighting resistance, you prevent it. Instead of overwhelming prospects with features, you guide them toward insight. Instead of forcing conclusions, you help them reach their own decisions. This creates smoother interactions, happier customers, and better outcomes for everyone involved. The principles in this book extend beyond sales and into all areas of influence. Whether you're leading teams, managing up, or influencing peers, these communication strategies help you achieve buy-in without pressure. They work because they respect human autonomy while guiding behavior in beneficial directions. The evidence supporting these methods comes from decades of research in cognitive psychology, behavioral economics, and social neuroscience. Laboratory studies have mapped how the brain responds to different types of messages, identified patterns that build trust, and discovered techniques that improve decision quality. This book distills that research into practical tools you can use immediately. Your competition likely relies on outdated scripts and aggressive tactics that trigger defensiveness. This gives you a significant advantage because you're operating from deeper understanding of human psychology. When you can speak to prospects' actual thought processes rather than fighting them, conversations flow more naturally and conversions happen more reliably. The transformation begins with awareness. Once you understand how your words affect listeners' nervous systems, you can't unsee it. Every conversation becomes an opportunity to apply ethical influence techniques that strengthen relationships while achieving your goals. This creates a positive feedback loop where better communication leads to better results, which reinforces your commitment to the approach. Ready to learn how to use your knowledge of the brain to create influence that builds rather than breaks trust? The next chapter introduces the fundamental switch that changes how prospects process everything you say from that moment forward. Chapter 1. The Persuasion Switch. Every conversation has a moment when the brain decides whether you're friend or foe. This moment determines whether someone hears your message as valuable information or threatening persuasion. Learning to recognize and activate this persuasion switch transforms how prospects respond to you. Traditional sales approaches treat all conversations as opportunities to sell immediately. Neuroscience shows this backfires because the brain needs time to shift into what researchers call receptive mode before influence becomes possible. When you try to persuade someone who's still in defensive mode, their brain treats your message as attack rather than assistance. The persuasion switch works like a neurological gatekeeper that filters incoming information. When someone feels safe and curious, the switch opens, and they actively search for valuable insights in what you say. When they feel pressured or threatened, the switch closes, and they mentally prepare to resist or escape. Your job is to flip this switch from closed to open before attempting any persuasion. This switch operates below conscious awareness, making it invisible to most people. They don't realize why some conversations feel productive while others feel pushy. They just know that with some salespeople they feel heard and open to learning, while with others they immediately become defensive and want the conversation to end. The difference lies entirely in whether you activate the persuasion switch. Research in social neuroscience identifies 3 key conditions that activate the persuasion switch. First, the other person must feel safe from judgment or pressure. Second, they need to sense that you understand their perspective and challenges. Third, they must experience you as someone who provides value rather than demands attention. When these conditions align, the brain shifts from defensive processing to active learning mode. The safety component matters most because threat perception shuts down cognitive flexibility. When the amygdala detects potential social threat, It redirects blood flow away from the prefrontal cortex, impairing complex thinking. This explains why prospects who initially seem interested suddenly become resistant when they sense a sales agenda. Their brain interprets the shift from helpful conversation to sales pitch as a threat to their autonomy. Curiosity represents the second crucial component because the brain pays attention to what seems novel or relevant to personal goals. When prospects feel curious about your solution, they naturally lean forward, ask questions, and mentally explore possibilities. This creates what psychologists call desirable difficulty that actually strengthens memory and engagement. Curiosity makes learning feel effortless even when dealing with complex information. The value perception component might seem counterintuitive because you're obviously trying to sell something. The key difference lies in how value gets communicated. When you provide immediate, tangible benefit in the conversation itself, prospects see you as a valuable resource rather than someone trying to extract value from them. This shift changes the entire psychological dynamic of the interaction. Recognizing the current state of someone's persuasion switch requires reading behavioral and linguistic cues. When the switch is closed, people use defensive language patterns, ask about price or commitment early, and give short, disengaged responses. When the switch opens, their language becomes exploratory. They ask about features and benefits, and they provide longer, more detailed answers to questions. Physical cues also reveal the switch state. Closed prospects sit back, cross arms, check phones, and create physical distance. Open prospects lean forward, maintain eye contact, nod actively, and mirror your gestures unconsciously. These cues happen faster than conscious thought, making them reliable indicators of neurological state rather than deliberate behavior. The most effective way to activate the persuasion switch involves what researchers call social proof of non-manipulation. This means providing evidence that your interest lies in helping rather than selling. You achieve this by asking genuine questions about their situation, reflecting their concerns back to them accurately, and offering specific insights that demonstrate understanding before proposing solutions. Opening questions should focus on their current reality rather than their desired future. Questions like, what's working well with your current approach, or what challenges are you facing this quarter, signal curiosity about their world rather than interest in making a sale. This positioning makes it safe for them to share information without feeling marketed to. Once you understand their situation, reflect their concerns back to them using their exact language when possible. This technique, called mirroring, activates mirror neurons that create neurological connection. When someone hears their own thoughts reflected accurately, their brain treats you as someone who genuinely understands them. This feeling of being seen and understood opens the persuasion switch automatically. Following reflection with validation strengthens the effect even further. Statements like "that makes complete sense" or "anyone in your position would feel that way" acknowledge their emotions as legitimate. This removes shame or embarrassment they might feel about their challenges, creating psychological safety that opens their mind to new possibilities. The transition from understanding to exploring solutions should feel like their idea rather than yours. You achieve this by asking about their preferred approach to solving the challenge they've identified. Questions like, how are you planning to address that? Or what's your strategy for handling situations like this? Make them the expert on their own problems while keeping the conversation collaborative. When they describe their current approach, point out specific gaps or opportunities you've seen before without positioning yourself as the solution. Saying something like, many companies in your situation find that approach effective, but often discover they can get better results by addressing X, plants the seed for your solution without feeling like you're selling anything. The actual persuasion phase should feel like helping them reach their own conclusion rather than convincing them of your position. You achieve this through a technique researchers call self-persuasion or attitude inoculation. Present the benefits they would experience if they solved their challenge, then ask if those outcomes would be valuable to them. When they agree, you're not persuading them about your solution anymore. You're just connecting it to outcomes they already value. This approach works because it respects their autonomy while providing the guidance they need. The brain interprets persuasion as threatening when it feels imposed from outside, but sees it as helpful when it flows from internal insights. Self-persuasion activates the same neural networks as internal motivation, creating the same powerful engagement without triggering defensive responses. Timing matters enormously with the persuasion switch because once it opens, you must maintain it carefully. Shifting too quickly back into sales language can slam the switch shut. Instead, gradually transition from understanding to solution exploration while maintaining the collaborative, curious tone. This gradual shift helps their brain adapt to the changing conversation dynamic without feeling threatened. The switch can close quickly if you make assumptions or provide unsolicited advice too early. Even after successfully opening their mind, remain attentive to their ongoing emotional state. Watch for signs that they feel overwhelmed or pressured, and immediately return to understanding mode if needed. This flexibility shows respect for their comfort level and keeps the persuasion switch open. Practice recognizing switch states in everyday conversations before applying the techniques in sales situations. Pay attention to when people become curious versus defensive in your regular interactions. Notice how your questions and responses affect their engagement level. This awareness builds the intuitive sensitivity needed to activate the persuasion switch reliably with prospects and clients. Some prospects will resist opening their persuasion switch no matter how skillfully you apply these techniques. This resistance usually stems from past negative experiences with salespeople or current stress that makes them wary of new commitments. Respect this resistance by acknowledging their caution as reasonable and offering to continue the conversation later when they might feel more open to exploring solutions. The most successful salespeople learn to activate the persuasion switch consistently because it creates natural buy-in rather than forced agreement. This approach produces higher quality leads, stronger relationships, and longer-lasting customer satisfaction. When people feel they arrived at their decision through their own thinking process rather than being persuaded, they feel confident about their choice and less likely to experience buyer remorse. Remember that activating the persuasion switch requires patience because rushing the process often closes it permanently. People need time to feel safe, understood, and curious before they're ready to consider new solutions. Your willingness to invest this time up front creates the foundation for stronger conversions and better relationships down the road. Begin every sales conversation by checking whether the persuasion switch is open or closed. Then take the specific steps needed to activate it before attempting any persuasion. Chapter 2. Value Priming Fundamentals. Every word you speak lands on fertile or rocky ground, depending on how you've prepared the listener's mind beforehand. This preparation happens through a neurological process called priming that occurs in milliseconds, shaping how people interpret everything that follows. Mastering value priming transforms ordinary conversations into receptive experiences where your message finds willing minds rather than defensive barriers. Priming works by activating specific mental frameworks that influence unconscious interpretation of subsequent information. When you prime someone for value, their brain becomes hypersensitive to benefits, opportunities, and positive outcomes. When you fail to prime or prime incorrectly, the same brain becomes alert for threats, problems, and reasons to say no. Understanding this process gives you control over the mental environment where your message takes root. The science behind priming begins in the subconscious mind, where associations form between concepts, emotions, and experiences. These associations create what researchers call spreading activation networks that connect related ideas instantly. When you activate one node in this network, connected nodes become more accessible for retrieval and influence how new information gets processed. This happens faster than conscious thought, making priming invisible to the person experiencing it. Consider what happens when someone starts a conversation by mentioning Monday's chaotic meeting. This phrase primes their brain for disorder, inefficiency, and frustration. Every question that follows gets filtered through this frame, making it harder for them to see solutions clearly. Alternatively, if the conversation begins with Monday's productive planning session, their mind becomes receptive to organization, progress, and effective solutions. The same facts get interpreted through entirely different filters. Value priming differs fundamentally from traditional sales techniques because it works with rather than against the brain's natural processing patterns. Instead of trying to overcome resistance, you prevent resistance by creating mental conditions where openness feels natural. This approach succeeds because it aligns with how people actually process information rather than how salespeople traditionally present it. The most powerful value priming happens through what researchers call conceptual fluency. This occurs when new information fits smoothly with existing mental models and goals. When your message feels cognitively easy to process, the brain interprets it as more trustworthy and valuable. This creates a positive feedback loop where ease of processing leads to more attention, which further increases comprehension and engagement. Visual priming happens before words even get spoken through environment, appearance, and body language. Meeting rooms with natural light and comfortable seating prime for collaboration and ease. Stressful environments filled with technology and formal arrangements prime for tension and formality. Your own appearance and demeanor create immediate priming effects that color how everything you say gets received. Dress choices carry enormous priming power because people make unconscious judgments about credibility, competence, and friendliness within seconds. Formality primes for professionalism, but can also prime for distance and intimidation. Business casual primes for approachability while maintaining competence. The key is matching your appearance to the mental state you want to activate in your prospect's mind. Linguistic priming involves carefully choosing the first words of every message to activate specific mental frameworks. Instead of starting with problems or objections, begin with outcomes or possibilities. Instead of mentioning costs or challenges, mention benefits and opportunities. This creates a mental context where subsequent information gets interpreted through the most favorable possible lens. Opening statements like, "I'm excited to share how teams like yours are achieving X results prime for success and achievement." This shifts their mental focus from current problems to future possibilities, making them more receptive to learning about solutions. Conversely, opening with "I know you're dealing with challenges in X area" primes them to stay focused on problems rather than opportunities. Conceptual priming works by activating emotional states that support receptivity to your message. Hope, curiosity, and possibility prime brains to be more open to learning and change. Fear, urgency, and scarcity can create pressure that closes down exploration and leads to defensive decisions. Understanding which emotions support your specific goals helps you choose the right priming strategy for each situation. The most effective emotional priming for sales conversations involves activating curiosity rather than desire. Curiosity creates engagement without pressure, leading to natural exploration and learning. When people feel curious about your solution, they lean forward, ask questions, and actively seek information. This active involvement makes them more receptive to understanding how your solution might work for their situation. Temporal priming involves framing your message in time contexts that influence how people evaluate it. Future-focused priming works well when selling solutions that require change or investment because it activates imagination and possibility thinking. Present-focused priming works better when addressing immediate problems or time-sensitive opportunities because it focuses attention on current realities. When discussing future outcomes, use vivid language that helps people mentally simulate the experience. Saying, "Imagine having X problem solved by next quarter," activates neural networks for future planning and goal achievement. This creates psychological investment in the positive outcome, making them more receptive to learning how to achieve it. Immediate outcome language helps people connect your solution to current benefits. Phrases like "This will streamline your process immediately," or "Your team can start seeing results this week," prime for quick wins and positive change. This works particularly well when prospects feel overwhelmed by current challenges and need reassurance that relief comes quickly. Priming must be authentic to work effectively because people unconsciously detect manipulation. Fake enthusiasm or exaggerated claims prime for skepticism rather than receptivity. Authentic curiosity about their situation and genuine enthusiasm for your solution primes for trust and engagement. The key difference lies in whether the priming feels like honest communication or psychological positioning. Contextual priming happens through the entire conversation setup, not just opening words. Scheduling enough time for proper discussion primes for depth and importance. Choosing comfortable meeting environments primes for collaboration rather than interrogation. Beginning with genuine questions about their situation primes for partnership rather than sales pressure. Each type of conversation requires different priming strategies. Cold calls need immediate trust and safety priming because prospects haven't chosen to engage with you. Follow-up conversations need opportunity priming that connects to previous discussions. Final negotiations need confidence priming that helps prospects feel secure about their decision. The timing of priming matters as much as the content because priming effects decay over time. Early priming gets reinforced by subsequent information, while late priming can feel forced or manipulative. The most effective approach involves spreading key priming messages throughout the conversation while maintaining consistent emotional and conceptual tone. Ethics matter in priming because you're affecting how people process information at an unconscious level. The line between helpful framing and manipulation lies in whether you're preparing them to make better decisions or pushing them toward outcomes they wouldn't choose if fully aware. Ethical priming helps people think more clearly, while manipulative priming distorts their thinking process. You can test whether your priming feels manipulative by asking whether you'd be comfortable being on the receiving end. If the techniques feel like honest preparation for productive conversation, they're ethical. If they feel like psychological positioning designed to get you to agree to something you wouldn't otherwise choose, they've crossed ethical boundaries. Practical value priming begins with the very first sentence you write or speak. Email subject lines, opening statements, and initial questions all prime how prospects will receive everything that follows. Take time to craft these priming elements carefully because they determine whether your message lands on receptive minds or defensive barriers. Practice value priming in low-stakes situations before applying it to important conversations. Notice how different opening questions affect people's engagement and responsiveness. Pay attention to how your environment and appearance influence the tone of interactions. This awareness builds the sensitivity needed to prime effectively in sales situations. Value priming creates the mental foundation where persuasion feels natural rather than forced. When people feel curious and hopeful rather than threatened and resistant, they explore possibilities more openly and reach decisions more confidently. This creates better outcomes for everyone involved while strengthening rather than damaging relationships. As you move through conversations this week, pay attention to how your opening words and environment influence the other person's responsiveness and engagement level. Chapter 3. The Trust Equation. Trust isn't built through charisma or charm, but through specific neurological processes that occur when certain chemical and social conditions align. Understanding these processes transforms trust from an abstract feeling into a measurable equation that you can apply consistently. The three key components of trust are neurochemical bonding through oxytocin, cognitive mirroring through mirror neurons, and emotional predictability through pattern recognition. Oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, gets released in the brain during positive social interactions that signal safety and connection. This neurochemical creates what researchers call approach motivation that makes people want to get closer rather than withdraw. When prospects release oxytocin during your conversations, they experience you as trustworthy and worth engaging with further. This happens automatically when they sense you understand and care about their perspective. Mirror neurons fire both when someone performs an action and when they observe someone else performing the same action. This neurological mechanism creates automatic empathy and rapport by making you literally feel what the other person feels. When mirror neurons activate strongly, prospects experience you as similar to themselves rather than different, which makes them more receptive to your suggestions and more likely to trust your judgment. Predictability creates trust through what psychologists call attachment security that develops when someone consistently responds in ways that match expectations. When your behavior remains steady and your words align with actions, prospects' brains learn they can rely on you. This predictability removes the mental energy required to constantly assess threat levels, freeing up cognitive resources for evaluating your message and solution. These three components work together synergistically to create what researchers term cognitive ease that makes persuasion feel natural and comfortable. When someone experiences you as chemically bonding, mentally mirroring, and behaviorally predictable, their brain processes your message through trust filters rather than skepticism filters. This shifts entire conversations from defensive to collaborative dynamics. The first component, oxytocin release, happens when prospects feel understood and valued as individuals rather than targets or transactions. You trigger this neurochemical response by demonstrating genuine curiosity about their situation and reflecting their concerns accurately back to them. This validation of their perspective creates the safety signals that prompt oxytocin release and approach motivation. Effective mirroring requires paying close attention to both verbal and nonverbal communication patterns while avoiding the trap of mimicking behavior obviously. Instead of copying gestures directly, mirror the energy level, pace of speech, and emotional tone that matches their current state. When someone feels stressed, a calm but engaged demeanor helps them feel safe. When someone feels excited, matching their enthusiasm helps them feel connected. The rhythm of conversation creates powerful priming for mirroring because people naturally sync their speech patterns, body language, and breathing with others they feel comfortable with. You can accelerate this synchronization process by subtly matching their speaking pace and energy level before gradually introducing your natural pace and tone. This creates a sense of familiarity that makes trust building feel effortless. Predictability builds through consistent delivery of what you promise, but even more through consistent emotional responses that match the situation appropriately. When you react with appropriate concern to their challenges and appropriate enthusiasm about potential solutions, your behavior becomes predictable and therefore trustworthy. Inconsistent emotional responses, even positive ones, create uncertainty that blocks trust development. Trust decay happens quickly when any component of the equation gets disrupted. A single mismatched response can shatter weeks of bonding if it feels manipulative rather than authentic. This means trust building requires sustained attention to all three components throughout every interaction. A conversation that begins with perfect mirroring can still fail if you become inconsistent or make promises you can't keep. The trust equation explains why traditional sales techniques often backfire, because they try to build trust through manipulation rather than authentic connection. Scripts that force specific responses break natural mirroring patterns and feel artificial rather than predictable. Aggressive closing techniques trigger threat responses that shut down oxytocin release and make mirror neurons stop firing. Early conversations should focus primarily on bonding through validation and understanding rather than solution delivery. This isn't manipulation because you're genuinely trying to understand their situation. The difference lies in whether your curiosity serves their needs first or your sales goals first. When your genuine concern for their situation drives the interaction, oxytocin release happens naturally and creates authentic foundation for subsequent influence. Mirroring techniques must feel organic rather than mechanical to work effectively. Forced or obvious mirroring gets detected consciously and creates discomfort that blocks trust building. Effective mirroring happens below conscious awareness through subtle matching of breathing patterns, speaking pace, and emotional tone. This creates the neurological conditions for trust while remaining authentic and respectful. Predictability in sales conversations means maintaining consistent emotional intelligence throughout the entire relationship. This doesn't mean being monotone or losing your natural personality. It means your responses remain appropriate to the situation and aligned with your stated values and goals. Prospects learn to rely on your reactions, which reduces their cognitive load and creates psychological safety. Trust transfer happens when someone you respect trusts the person you're introducing them to. But this transfer only works when the existing trust remains strong. Trying to borrow trust from relationships that aren't solid actually damages your credibility. Focus on building your own trust equation rather than relying on transferred trust that may not survive scrutiny. The digital trust equation requires adapting these principles to virtual interactions where physical cues remain limited. Video calls provide some mirror neuron activation through visual cues, but phone conversations require extra attention to vocal mirroring and emotional consistency. Written communication demands even more careful attention to predictable tone and authentic concern because people read more skepticism into text. Building trust across cultural differences requires understanding how different societies prioritize various components of the trust equation. Some cultures value predictability most highly, while others prioritize emotional bonding or intellectual mirroring. Researching cultural norms before important conversations helps you adjust your approach appropriately without losing authenticity. Trust repair follows different patterns than initial trust building because people become more sensitive to inconsistency after feeling betrayed. Regaining trust requires acknowledging the disruption, accepting responsibility without excuses, and then rebuilding all three components more deliberately than before. Many relationships can't survive trust damage, making prevention through consistent trustworthiness far more valuable than repair techniques. The credibility component of trust gets built through expertise demonstration, but expertise without warmth creates intellectual respect rather than emotional trust. People need to feel you understand them personally before they trust your professional judgment. This means balancing competence communication with personal connection to activate all components of the trust equation simultaneously. Trust measurement happens through attention to micro-behaviors that indicate neurological safety. When the trust equation works, people lean forward physically, maintain comfortable eye contact, and use open body language. When trust breaks down, they create physical distance, avoid eye contact, and adopt defensive postures. These cues happen automatically, making them more reliable than verbal assurances. Creating sustainable trust requires building systems that maintain all three components over time rather than relying on momentary connection. This means developing consistent processes for relationship maintenance, predictable quality delivery, and ongoing emotional attunement. Companies with the strongest customer relationships invest systematically in trust building rather than treating it as a sales skill. The trust equation applies to internal relationships as much as external ones, meaning colleagues and managers respond to the same neurological processes as prospects. Building trust at work through consistent bonding, mirroring, and predictability creates better collaboration and influence opportunities throughout your career. The same principles that make prospects comfortable make teams more effective. Trust marketing works by consistently demonstrating all three components of the trust equation over time rather than in isolated moments. Brand trust develops through repeated experiences that prove predictability, genuine concern for customers, and authentic representation. Companies that master this consistency win long-term loyalty that survives competitive pressures and economic downturns. The relationship between trust and conversion remains strong because buying decisions carry emotional risk that requires psychological safety to execute. People don't make significant purchases from people or companies they don't trust because the potential cost of being wrong feels too high. Trust reduces this perceived risk enough to make action feel safe rather than dangerous. Digital communication requires heightened attention to trust building because the medium strips away many physical cues that support mirroring and bonding. Phone conversations need extra vocal warmth to compensate for missing visual cues. Email messages need extra attention to tone and consistency to maintain predictability across asynchronous communication. Video calls provide the best digital environment for trust building because they preserve most physical cues. Trust debt accumulates when you promise more than you deliver or when you fail to maintain consistent emotional availability. This debt creates future challenges because prospects remember trust failures more vividly than trust successes. Managing trust debt means setting realistic expectations and consistently meeting or exceeding them, while acknowledging when you can't deliver exactly what you promised. Cultural adaptation of trust building requires research into how different societies interpret the three components of the trust equation. Some cultures view direct mirroring as insincere, while others see it as respectful. Predictability requirements vary significantly across cultures, with some preferring consistent formal behavior, while others expect emotional flexibility. Adapting your approach without compromising authenticity creates the foundation for trust across cultural boundaries. When trust feels fragile, return to the fundamentals of the trust equation by focusing on one component at a time. Bonding through validation when mirror neurons aren't firing, mirroring when emotional connection feels distant, or predictability through consistent follow-through when trust feels uncertain. The key is maintaining authenticity while deliberately strengthening whatever trust component needs attention. Check people's comfort level through body language. Ask clarifying questions that show genuine curiosity, and follow through consistently on every commitment you make. Chapter 4. Language that calms the critic. Every conversation contains a hidden critic that monitors everything you say for potential threats to safety, status, or autonomy. This critic operates through the amygdala, an ancient brain system designed to detect danger in milliseconds. When the critic feels threatened, it hijacks rational thinking and pushes people toward fight, flight, or freeze responses that block productive communication. Learning to speak to this critic directly transforms resistant prospects into engaged collaborators. The critic exists because human brains evolved to prioritize survival over accuracy. Missing a real threat meant death, while missing a sales opportunity meant inconvenience. This genetic programming makes people hypersensitive to language patterns that feel manipulative, controlling, or dismissive. Even subtle cues, like overly confident claims or rushed conclusions, trigger threat responses that shut down cognitive flexibility and block learning. Sales conversations activate the critic particularly strongly because people associate sales with pressure, deception, and loss of control. Past experiences with pushy salespeople or disappointing purchases create heightened sensitivity to anything that sounds like manipulation. The critic becomes hypervigilant, constantly scanning for signs that you're trying to trick them into decisions they wouldn't make freely. Understanding this threat system explains why logical arguments often fail to persuade skeptical prospects. When the amygdala gets activated, blood flow shifts away from the prefrontal cortex, where complex thinking happens. This means prospects literally cannot process your carefully reasoned points because their brain is focused on escape rather than evaluation. No amount of logic can overcome a brain in defensive mode. The solution involves speaking directly to the critic through language that signals safety, choice, and respect for autonomy. When the critic feels secure, it stops hijacking the thinking process and allows rational evaluation to resume. This creates the neurological conditions where persuasion becomes possible without triggering resistance or defensiveness. The same message that fails when delivered through threatening language succeeds when framed through safety signals. Threat triggers in sales language include absolute claims like "this will definitely solve your problem," or "you'll regret not acting now." These statements trigger the critic because they feel like attempts to bypass rational evaluation. The brain interprets certainty without supporting evidence as manipulation rather than confidence. Even true claims sound manipulative when delivered with too much certainty or urgency. Controlling language patterns also trigger the critic, even when they serve legitimate purposes. Phrases like "you need to" or "you should consider" make people feel their autonomy is being challenged. The critic interprets this as social threat that requires defensive responses. The same advice feels helpful when presented as options rather than requirements, because it preserves the person's sense of control over their own decisions. Uncertainty language paradoxically builds trust, because it signals you respect their ability to think for themselves. Saying "this might be relevant to your situation," rather than "this is exactly what you need," acknowledges their autonomy while providing useful information. The critic finds this respectful approach safe rather than threatening, creating openness to learning more about your solution. Permission-based phrasing works particularly well because it gives the critic explicit control over the conversation flow. Asking, "Would you be open to exploring how this might work for you, or would it make sense to look at the details?" puts the prospect in charge of deciding whether to continue. This respect for their autonomy calms the critic and creates genuine engagement rather than forced politeness. Validation statements help calm the critic by acknowledging their concerns as reasonable rather than dismissible. Instead of immediately trying to overcome objections, begin by validating the thinking behind them. "That's a smart question," or "anyone in your position would want to understand," that makes the critic feel heard rather than challenged. This emotional safety allows rational evaluation to resume. Gradual disclosure helps the critic feel safe by preventing information overload that can feel threatening. Instead of presenting the entire solution at once, break it into digestible pieces and check comfort level before continuing. Does this direction feel helpful so far, or would you like me to elaborate on any part of this? Gives the critic control over pace and depth of exploration. Future-focused language helps the critic because it removes pressure for immediate decisions. Discussing possibilities rather than requirements creates psychological safety that allows open exploration. If you decided this was right for your team, rather than "when you decide to implement this," keeps the critic relaxed, while still allowing meaningful conversation about outcomes. Comparative framing works by acknowledging trade-offs rather than claiming perfection. Saying, "like any solution, this has both strengths and limitations," makes the critic feel you're being honest rather than hiding flaws. This transparency creates trust that makes the critic more willing to consider your proposal fairly, because you haven't triggered the deception detection system. Time pressure language triggers the critic because it feels like manipulation designed to bypass careful evaluation. Instead of artificial urgency, focus on genuine timing considerations. This calendar quarter gives you enough time to implement properly, provides helpful information without making the critic feel cornered or rushed into decisions they might regret. Curiosity-based questions help the critic because they shift the focus from selling to learning. What would success look like for your team, or how do you evaluate solutions like this? Makes the critic feel you're genuinely interested in their perspective rather than trying to get something from them. This collaborative tone calms threat responses and creates genuine engagement. The most powerful critic calming language involves what researchers call self-distancing that allows people to examine their own thinking more objectively. From your perspective, what factors matter most in this decision, or what would you want to understand before feeling confident about moving forward? Helps them step back from emotional threat responses and engage their rational evaluation systems. Story-based explanations work better than feature lists because they engage emotional processing systems that feel safer than abstract claims. When you show how someone similar to them solved comparable challenges, the critic sees this as helpful information rather than pressure. The story format makes complex concepts feel concrete and relevant while avoiding the threat triggers that come with direct selling. Metaphor language helps the critic because it provides multiple frames for understanding without triggering rigid thinking patterns. Instead of "this software increases efficiency by 30%, saying "this becomes like adding an extra person to your team, but without the hiring process, activates visual processing and emotional engagement that feels safer than statistical claims." Silence and pauses give the critic time to process information without feeling rushed or pressured. After asking important questions, wait for responses rather than filling silence with more arguments. This respect for their processing time signals that you're not trying to overwhelm or trick them. The critic finds this pacing comfortable and engaging rather than threatening. Emotional acknowledgement language works by naming the feelings the critic might be experiencing. "I can imagine this feels like a big decision," or "it's natural to want to think through all the implications," normalizes their internal experience rather than dismissing or minimizing it. This validation reduces threat responses and allows focus to return to the substantive issues. Closing language that respects autonomy actually increases commitment because it preserves the critic's sense of control. Instead of pressure tactics, offer clear next steps with no strings attached. "Would you like me to send the information we discussed?" so you can review it when you're ready gives them control while keeping the conversation moving forward productively. The transition from resistant to engage happens when the critic feels genuinely safe to explore possibilities without pressure for immediate decisions. This creates the neurological conditions where learning becomes possible and decisions feel natural rather than forced. The same person who starts defensively often becomes enthusiastic when language patterns consistently signal respect for their autonomy and intelligence. Remember that the critic serves an important protective function, so your goal isn't to override it, but to create conditions where it doesn't need to stay activated. When people feel truly safe to make their own decisions, they engage their full intelligence rather than just their defensive systems. This leads to better decisions for everyone involved while maintaining the trust that makes long-term relationships possible. The critic remains active throughout conversations, so monitor for signs that threat responses are reactivating. Hasty answers, brief responses, or defensive body language indicate the critic feels threatened again. When this happens, immediately return to safety language that acknowledges their concerns and gives them control over pace and direction. This responsiveness shows respect for their psychological safety and keeps the conversation productive. A sales representative noticed that one client always became resistant whenever she mentioned pricing or implementation timelines. By changing her language to include more permission-based phrasing and validation statements, the same client became curious about solutions and eventually became one of her most enthusiastic advocates. The critic simply needed to feel safe before it would allow rational evaluation to resume. Chapter 5. Memory Anchors That Stick. Every word you speak during a sales conversation either strengthens or weakens the memory trace that prospects carry with them after you leave. Memory formation happens through specific neurological processes that you can influence deliberately. When you understand how the brain encodes and retrieves information, you can plant memory anchors that make your key messages surface automatically when prospects need them most. This creates what researchers call retrieval cues that activate your solution in their minds at the exact moment when they make decisions. Memory anchors work because human brains store information through networks of connections rather than isolated facts. When you present information in ways that link it to existing knowledge, emotions, and experiences, you create multiple pathways for retrieval. This means prospects can remember your message even when they're not consciously trying to recall it. The memory becomes part of their mental landscape rather than just something they heard during a meeting. The encoding specificity principle states that memory works best when the conditions during encoding match the conditions during retrieval. This explains why prospects often remember conversations perfectly when discussing them with colleagues, but struggle to recall details when making purchasing decisions alone. Your job is to encode your messages in ways that will be retrievable during the decision-making context they actually experience. Strong memory anchors create what psychologists call episodic memory, that stores not just facts, but the entire context of the experience. When you help prospects remember the conversation where they learned about your solution, you give them access to all the emotional and cognitive processing that happened during that moment. This context makes it easier for them to retrieve and justify their decision to move forward. Emotional encoding happens automatically during high arousal moments, but you can influence which emotions get linked to your message. Fear creates powerful, but negative memory traces that make people avoid thinking about your solution. Hope and curiosity create positive memory traces that make people want to revisit your conversation. Choose the emotions you want to associate with your solution and craft your delivery to evoke those feelings consistently. Visual encoding works because the brain processes images much more efficiently than abstract concepts. When you help prospects mentally visualize how your solution works in their specific environment, you create visual memory traces that are incredibly resistant to forgetting. The brain stores these visual memories differently than verbal information, making them more accessible during decision-making moments. Spatial encoding takes advantage of the brain's natural tendency to remember locations and positions. Using consistent metaphors, physical examples, or spatial analogies helps prospects place your solution in mental maps that organize information. This spatial organization makes retrieval easier because the brain can navigate to your message using location-based memory cues. Temporal encoding involves connecting your message to specific time periods that feel relevant to the prospect's planning cycles. When your solution gets linked to quarterly goals, budget cycles, or seasonal opportunities, it becomes part of their time-based decision-making process. This makes it more likely to surface when they're making plans that involve timing considerations. Social encoding happens when prospects discuss your solution with colleagues, managers, or other stakeholders. By anticipating their likely questions and preparing retrieval cues that support positive memory, you create better outcomes for these social moments. When they can easily remember and explain your solution to others, you multiply your influence through their network. The repetition paradox in memory states that information repeated too often becomes less memorable, while information repeated at optimal intervals becomes highly memorable. Strategic repetition means bringing up key messages at different points in the conversation, while varying the language and context. This creates multiple memory traces without triggering the mental fatigue that kills engagement. Primacy effects make the beginning of conversations particularly important for memory formation. The first few minutes create strong memory traces that influence how everything else gets encoded. Use this time to establish the core value proposition in ways that feel memorable and important. First impressions of your solution create the framework that shapes how prospects interpret all subsequent information. Recency effects make the end of conversations crucial for memory formation as well. What happens in the final minutes gets encoded more strongly than middle portions of the meeting. End conversations with clear, memorable summaries that emphasize the most important benefits and next steps. This creates strong retrieval cues that prospects will use when making decisions. Contextual cues involve linking your message to specific environmental factors that prospects will encounter again. Meeting room details, conversation topics, or specific phrases you use can become retrieval cues that activate memory of your solution. This contextual linking happens unconsciously, but powerfully influences decision-making. Chunking techniques help the brain organize complex information into memorable units. Instead of presenting 8 separate benefits, group them into 2 or 3 categories that feel logical together. This organizational structure makes the information easier to process and remember, while providing frameworks that prospects can use when discussing your solution with others. Story-based memory creation works because human brains are wired for narrative thinking. Facts presented in story format get remembered better than facts presented as lists. Help prospects see your solution as part of a larger story about their success, and they'll remember the key elements automatically when they need to make decisions. Contrast encoding helps prospects remember your solution by highlighting what makes it different from alternatives. When they can clearly articulate how your approach differs from other solutions, they create stronger memory traces that support confident decisions. This contrast makes your solution more distinctive and easier to recall during comparisons. The Zeigarnik effect explains why people remember incomplete tasks better than completed ones. Create healthy tension around the need to solve their challenge by highlighting the cost of not taking action. This unresolved tension keeps your solution active in their memory until they take steps to resolve it, making follow-up conversations more productive. State-dependent memory means that people remember information better when they're in similar emotional and cognitive states during encoding and retrieval. Match your energy level and communication style to the state prospects will be in when making decisions. If they'll be stressed during decision-making, encode your message with appropriate concern. If they'll be optimistic, encode it with enthusiasm. Memory consolidation happens during sleep, so information presented late in the day gets stronger processing overnight than morning presentations. Schedule important conversations or presentations later in the day when possible, especially for complex solutions that require substantial processing. This timing takes advantage of natural memory consolidation processes. Emotional intensity affects memory strength, but only when the emotion feels relevant to the content. Artificial excitement that doesn't match the actual importance of your message creates weak or negative memory traces. Match emotional intensity to the genuine significance of your solution, so prospects remember appropriately without feeling manipulated. The generation effect means people remember information better when they actively participate in creating it rather than passively receiving it. Ask prospects to imagine how your solution would work in their specific situation. This mental generation creates stronger memory traces than simply explaining how it works in general terms. Mnemonic devices work in business contexts when they're simple and relevant to the prospect situation. Acronyms, rhymes, or visual metaphors that relate to their industry or role become powerful retrieval cues. The mnemonic should be easy to use during decision-making moments rather than requiring complex mental gymnastics. Cross-modal encoding involves presenting information through multiple senses or communication channels. Verbal explanations combined with visual demonstrations or physical examples create multiple memory pathways that increase retrieval probability. Each additional pathway makes it more likely they'll remember your message when making decisions. Temporal spacing of follow-up conversations can strengthen memory by creating spaced repetition that enhances consolidation. Regular check-ins that reference previous conversations help maintain and strengthen memory traces over time. This relationship maintenance works because it aligns with natural memory strengthening processes. Ethical memory anchoring means creating retrieval cues that help prospects make better decisions rather than manipulating them into choices they wouldn't make if fully aware. The line between helpful memory and manipulative influence lies in whether the memory serves their interests or just yours. Always consider the prospect's well-being when designing memory strategies. The forgetting curve, discovered by psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus, shows that people forget most new information quickly unless it's actively reinforced. Design follow-up conversations and materials to hit the memory curve at optimal moments when consolidation is strongest. This strategic reinforcement keeps your solution active in their decision-making process. Testimonial integration works by helping prospects remember success stories as if they were their own experiences. When they can mentally place themselves in the success story, the memory becomes personally relevant and more powerful. This vicarious experience creates emotional and cognitive engagement that supports confident decisions. Metaphor anchoring involves creating visual or conceptual metaphors that organize complex information in memorable ways. Instead of explaining technical processes, use metaphors that help prospects visualize how your solution works. These metaphors become retrieval cues that make complex concepts accessible during decision-making. The key to effective memory anchoring lies in making your solution part of how prospects think about their challenges and opportunities. When your solution becomes integrated into their mental framework for understanding their business, you don't need to remind them of your conversation. They remember because the solution has become part of their thinking process. Imagine being able to sit in on the internal conversations prospects have about your solution with their teams, understanding exactly what memory cues would help them articulate why your approach makes sense and how it would benefit their organization. Picture a scenario where your solution becomes so well integrated into a prospect's mental framework that they explain it to colleagues using the exact metaphors and examples you provided, without remembering consciously where those concepts originated. Chapter 6. Fluency and Familiarity Triggers. Human brains evolved to prefer what feels easy to understand over what is most accurate or comprehensive. This preference for cognitive fluency shapes how people evaluate information, make decisions, and respond to complex ideas. When your message feels difficult to process, the brain interprets this difficulty as evidence that the information might be dangerous, deceptive, or simply not worth the mental effort. Understanding fluency triggers transforms complex solutions into approachable conversations that prospects engage with confidently rather than avoid. Cognitive fluency happens when information flows smoothly through the brain's processing systems without triggering confusion or overload. The brain has limited working memory capacity, and when this capacity gets exceeded, people experience mental friction that feels unpleasant. This friction creates a negative association with whatever information triggered it, making prospects less likely to consider your solution seriously regardless of its actual merit. The familiarity principle shows that people develop preference for things they recognize, even when they don't remember specific details. This happens because recognition requires less cognitive effort than full processing of new information. The brain interprets familiar patterns as safer and more trustworthy, while novel patterns trigger caution that requires additional mental energy to evaluate properly. You can use this bias ethically by connecting new concepts to familiar frameworks. Simple language works better than complex language, not because people are unintelligent, but because cognitive simplicity allows attention to focus on meaning rather than decoding vocabulary. When prospects understand your words easily, their brains can devote mental resources to evaluating your ideas. When they struggle with language, mental energy gets consumed by word parsing rather than concept comprehension, making persuasion nearly impossible. Rhythm and flow in speech create fluency through what researchers call prosodic processing that happens below conscious awareness. When your speaking pattern matches natural breath and thought rhythms, the brain interprets this harmony as evidence of truth and trustworthiness. Jarring speech patterns, rushed delivery, or inconsistent pacing trigger unconscious discomfort that blocks message acceptance. Visual clarity amplifies fluency by providing multiple pathways for information processing. Charts, diagrams, and visual metaphors help the brain organize complex concepts into manageable chunks that feel approachable. The same information presented purely through text often feels overwhelming and gets dismissed as too complicated, while the same information presented visually feels manageable and worth exploring. Chunking strategies work by breaking complex solutions into small, digestible pieces that feel comfortable to process one at a time. Instead of overwhelming prospects with comprehensive feature lists, present information in logical sequences that build understanding progressively. This approach honors the brain's natural information processing limits while maintaining engagement throughout the learning process. Comparative familiarity helps prospects understand new concepts by connecting them to things they already know and trust. Saying this works like having an assistant who never forgets is more fluent than this utilizes advanced machine learning algorithms for pattern recognition. The familiar comparison makes the complex concept immediately understandable without sacrificing accuracy. Contextual fluency happens when you present your solution within familiar frameworks that prospects already use to organize their thinking. Using terminology from their industry, referencing their current processes, and speaking to their established priorities creates immediate cognitive ease. This familiarity makes your solution feel like a natural extension of their existing world rather than something foreign that requires extensive learning. Temporal fluency involves pacing information at speeds that allow comfortable processing without feeling rushed or drawn out. Too fast triggers anxiety about keeping up, while too slow creates impatience that kills engagement. The optimal pace varies by individual, but staying slightly slower than your natural inclination often works best because most people speak faster than their listeners can comfortably process. Repetition patterns that vary slightly create what researchers call variety-induced familiarity, where repeated concepts feel fresh while remaining recognizable. Saying this feature saves time, reduces errors, and streamlines your workflow uses slight variation around the same core benefit. This technique maintains attention while reinforcing the key message through multiple angles. Metaphor fluency works because concrete metaphors provide familiar mental structures for understanding abstract concepts. Instead of explaining complex technical processes, use metaphors that draw on everyday experiences prospects understand deeply. This is like adding lanes to a crowded highway, makes capacity planning immediately visual and understandable for almost anyone. Reading level adjustments matter because cognitive fluency depends on matching information complexity to the brain's current processing capacity. While you shouldn't talk down to prospects, matching your vocabulary level to their comfort zone prevents unnecessary cognitive friction. Technical terms work when prospects have domain expertise, but plain language works better when discussing concepts outside their specialized knowledge. Environmental familiarity helps prospects feel comfortable by placing them in contexts they recognize and trust. Meeting in their office rather than yours, using familiar technology, and referencing their normal processes creates immediate ease that opens them to learning about your solution. This comfort reduces the mental energy required to evaluate new information. Social fluency develops when prospects feel they understand your communication style and can predict your responses. Consistent emotional tone, predictable question sequences, and reliable follow-up behavior create psychological safety that allows focused attention on your message rather than processing your personality. This predictability reduces cognitive load and increases receptivity. Emotional fluency happens when your emotional expressions match the content and context appropriately. Exaggerated enthusiasm for minor benefits feels manipulative and breaks fluency, while genuine concern for major challenges creates emotional alignment that makes your message more compelling. Matching emotional intensity to actual significance maintains credibility while supporting engagement. The processing fluency effect shows that information that feels easy to understand gets judged as more true and valuable than identical information that feels difficult to process. This happens unconsciously, making fluency one of the most powerful influences on persuasion. The same proposal feels more convincing when presented fluently rather than clumsily, even when the content remains identical. Cultural fluency requires adapting communication patterns to match cultural expectations for what feels familiar and comfortable. Some cultures prefer direct, explicit communication, while others value subtle, contextual approaches. Understanding these cultural preferences prevents fluency breaks that occur when your communication style clashes with their cultural framework. Digital fluency becomes crucial in virtual environments where you lack physical presence to support comprehension. Video calls require extra attention to visual clarity, vocal pacing, and technological reliability because digital communication already creates fluency barriers. Phone conversations need enhanced vocal warmth and clarity to compensate for missing visual cues. Training your communication for fluency requires systematic practice with feedback about how your delivery affects listener comprehension. Record yourself presenting solutions and pay attention to moments where listeners show signs of confusion or disengagement. These moments indicate fluency breaks that can be corrected through practice and refinement. Progressive disclosure creates fluency by revealing complexity gradually rather than overwhelming prospects immediately. Start with the big picture that feels immediately understandable, then gradually introduce details as they show interest and readiness for deeper information. This approach respects their cognitive limits while maintaining engagement throughout the learning process. Cross-modal fluency involves presenting the same information through multiple channels that support different learning styles. Verbal explanations, supplemented by visual demonstrations or written summaries, create multiple processing pathways that increase overall fluency. Each additional channel reduces cognitive load on any single processing system. Fluency testing helps you identify and eliminate communication barriers that block message acceptance. Ask prospects to summarize key points in their own words. Observe their body language during explanations, and notice where they ask clarifying questions. These reactions reveal fluency problems you can address by simplifying language, reorganizing information, or providing better supporting materials. The relationship between fluency and trust appears strong because people interpret ease of processing as evidence of honest communication. Complex language feels suspicious because people associate clarity with transparency and honesty. When you make complex ideas easy to understand, prospects interpret this as respect for their intelligence and confidence in your solution. Familiarity building requires balance between connecting to existing knowledge and introducing necessary new concepts. Too much familiarity feels boring and patronizing, while too much novelty feels threatening and overwhelming. The optimal mix varies by prospect, but aiming for about 80% familiar elements with 20% fresh perspectives often creates comfortable engagement. Remember that fluency serves prospects by making complex information accessible, but it must never sacrifice accuracy or completeness for simplicity. The goal is presenting truth in ways that feel approachable rather than oversimplifying reality. Ethical fluency helps people understand better rather than manipulating them into false conclusions. Audit your current communication patterns for fluency barriers by recording conversations and paying attention to where listeners show confusion, frustration, or disengagement. Chapter 7. Permission-based closing. Traditional closing techniques treat buying decisions as battles where you must overcome resistance and force agreement. Neuroscience reveals this approach backfires because it triggers threat responses that block rational evaluation and damage trust. Permission-based closing works differently by treating buying decisions as natural conclusions to collaborative exploration. When you ask for commitment in ways that preserve autonomy and choice, prospects experience saying yes as empowering rather than being pressured into decisions they might regret. The key difference lies in how the brain processes choices when they feel imposed versus chosen. Imposed choices activate the amygdala and trigger defensive responses that make people want to say no simply to preserve their sense of control. Chosen decisions activate reward pathways that create positive associations with the decision and the person who made it possible. Permission-based closing creates the neurological conditions where saying yes feels natural and confident rather than coerced. Closing pressure happens when you make the prospect responsible for managing your emotional state around their decision. Comments like, "I really need this deal," or "this would mean so much to my team," transfer your anxiety to them, making them feel guilty about taking time to think. This emotional manipulation triggers threat responses that close down exploration and create resistance even when they like your solution. Choice architecture in ethical closing involves presenting clear options that all move the process forward while preserving their control over pace and scope. Instead of forcing binary decisions between yes and no, offer choices like, "Would you like to explore implementation timeline options?" or "Should we look at the budget planning implications?" These choices feel empowering while keeping the momentum toward a positive outcome. Micro-commitments work because they create small wins that build toward larger decisions without triggering threat responses. Asking, "Does this direction feel helpful?" or "Would you like to see how this applies to your specific situation?" gets them to agree to small steps that naturally lead toward full commitment. Each micro-commitment activates reward pathways that make the next step feel easier and more appealing. The commitment and consistency principle shows that people feel psychological pressure to act in ways that match their previous commitments, but only when those commitments feel voluntary and self-authored. Permission-based closing creates this pressure ethically by helping prospects discover their own reasons for moving forward. When they articulate their own benefits and next steps, they become committed to following through on their stated intentions. Silence, after asking permission-based questions, creates powerful psychological space where prospects can process their own thoughts about moving forward. This silence feels uncomfortable for most people, but fighting the urge to fill it often leads to better outcomes because it gives their brain time to resolve the cognitive tension around making decisions. The silence itself becomes part of the psychological process of committing. Permission-based questions that acknowledge the normalcy of taking time to decide reduce pressure while maintaining momentum. Saying, "This is a big decision, and I want to make sure you feel completely confident before moving forward," acknowledges their need for thorough evaluation while offering continued support. This validation of their process makes them more likely to complete their evaluation rather than abandon the conversation. Progressive permission works by asking for increasingly specific levels of commitment while maintaining their sense of control throughout the process. Start with interest validation, move to solution fit confirmation, then timing comfort, and finally implementation readiness. Each step builds toward full commitment while giving them multiple opportunities to pause or redirect without feeling like they're backing out of previous agreements. The future self technique in closing helps prospects visualize themselves having made the decision and experiencing the positive outcomes. Imagine having this implemented by next quarter, or Picture your team working with this solution, creates mental simulation that makes the decision feel real and desirable. This technique works because it helps them experience the benefits before committing to the action. Choice elimination works by helping prospects choose between different positive options rather than between action and inaction. Would you prefer to start with the pilot program or go straight to full implementation? Assumes they're moving forward while giving them control over the approach. This reframing shifts the decision from should I buy to how should I buy. The specificity principle in closing states that specific commitments feel more manageable and less threatening than vague agreements. Instead of asking, "Are you ready to move forward?" ask, "Would you like to schedule the implementation planning session for next Tuesday or Thursday?" Specific options make the commitment feel concrete and achievable rather than overwhelming. Scarcity in ethical closing comes from genuine limitations rather than artificial pressure. This quarter gives us enough time to implement properly, or the next training cohort starts in 2 weeks, creates natural urgency without manipulation. This authentic scarcity helps prospects prioritize the decision without feeling tricked into premature commitment. Social proof integration in closing involves showing them how others similar to them made successful decisions without making them feel pressured to follow the crowd. Many teams in your situation found that starting with a pilot program gave them confidence to expand, provide social validation, while leaving them in control of their own timing and approach. The foot-in-the-door technique works ethically when each step truly serves their interests and represents genuine progress toward their goals. Starting with small, helpful commitments and gradually moving toward larger ones builds trust and creates natural momentum. The progression feels organic rather than manipulative because each step delivers real value. Closing language should avoid urgency words that trigger threat responses and instead use possibility words that activate curiosity and hope. When you're ready to move forward rather than "you need to decide now," preserves their autonomy while keeping the conversation oriented toward positive outcomes. This language difference often determines whether they feel excited or defensive about committing. Risk mitigation in closing involves acknowledging and addressing their concerns about potential negative outcomes rather than trying to convince them the risks don't exist. What concerns do you have about moving forward? Followed by specific problem solving around those issues creates collaborative problem solving rather than adversarial debate. This approach makes them feel supported rather than pressured. The reward anticipation effect shows that people become more committed to decisions when they can visualize specific benefits they'll receive. Permission-based closing helps them mentally simulate positive outcomes through questions like, "What would it mean for your team to have this challenge resolved by quarter end?" This mental rehearsal makes the decision feel rewarding and worth pursuing. Timing permission involves asking for commitment at moments when their cognitive load is low and they feel most receptive to decision-making. After successfully addressing their concerns and showing clear value, when they're asking detailed questions about implementation, or when they mention upcoming deadlines that your solution could help address. Reading these receptivity cues helps time your closing questions for maximum effectiveness. Follow-up permission works by giving them control over how the decision process continues rather than forcing immediate commitment. Would you like to discuss this with your team first, or should I send you the implementation timeline so you can review it when you have time? Maintains momentum while respecting their need for additional information or consultation. The autonomy restoration principle shows that people become more willing to commit when they feel their decision-making power has been respected throughout the process. Permission-based closing succeeds because it increases rather than decreases their sense of control. When they feel genuinely free to say no but choose to say yes, the commitment feels empowering rather than limiting. Cultural considerations matter in permission-based closing because different societies have different comfort levels with direct questions and explicit commitment requests. Some cultures prefer indirect approaches that allow face-saving options, while others value direct communication that respects everyone's time. Adapting your permission-based approach to cultural expectations maintains ethical influence while respecting cultural norms. Remember that permission-based closing works best when you've built genuine value throughout the conversation rather than trying to force commitment at the end of an interaction that hasn't served their interests. The closing becomes a natural conclusion to collaborative exploration rather than a separate sales tactic. When this alignment exists, permission-based questions often receive positive responses because they match the logical conclusion of a productive conversation. This week, notice where your closing questions might be triggering resistance, and experiment with permission-based alternatives that preserve autonomy while maintaining momentum toward positive outcomes. Chapter 8. The demo that sells itself. When you let a prospect watch your solution work, the brain processes that experience in ways that words alone cannot achieve. Neural pathways that underlie curiosity, ownership, and mirror neuron resonance light up when a demonstration feels authentic and collaborative. The result is a prospect who experiences the benefits before they have to decide, making the final ask feel like a natural conclusion rather than a sales push. This chapter shows how to design demos that tap those circuits, keep the threat system quiet, and turn passive viewing into active buying. Start by priming the room for psychological safety. You want the amygdala to stay calm, so open with a brief validation of the prospect's current challenges. A simple line such as, "You mentioned that tracking project timelines has been a constant pain point," signals that you understand the pain and creates a safe frame for exploration. Then outline the demo's purpose in language that emphasizes discovery. What we'll do today is see how this platform can turn that process into a 5-minute routine. By framing the demo as a joint investigation, you reduce the perception of pressure and invite the prospect to engage their own curiosity. Control the narrative arc from the moment the screen lights up. Neuroscientists have found that people remember information that follows a clear, forward-moving story better than isolated features. Begin with the end state. Show the finished dashboard, the clean report, the satisfied client, so the brain can immediately see the value. Use vivid language to help them imagine the outcome. Imagine having a single view that updates automatically as each task moves forward. This mental simulation activates the brain's future self circuitry, making the solution feel personally relevant before any detail is shown. Bring the prospect into the demonstration physically. Mirror neuron research shows that people unconsciously mimic actions they observe, which creates a sense of participation even when they are only watching. Point to specific data fields and ask, "What does this column mean for your reporting?" When they respond, you're prompting them to mentally place themselves in the process, which deepens ownership. Encourage short, concrete actions like clicking a button, typing a single data point, or moving a slider. The act of doing, however minimal, triggers the brain's reward pathways and makes the solution feel already theirs. Maintain fluency by presenting information in digestible chunks. The human working memory can hold only a few items at a time. A demo that floods the screen with features overwhelms the mind and triggers threat responses. Break the walkthrough into 3 to 4 logical segments: setup, data entry, analytics, and result. For each segment, start with a brief overview. Then walk through the steps and pause for a quick summary. Say, "We've just set up a project template. Next, we'll add the tasks you mentioned earlier." This rhythm respects cognitive limits while keeping the narrative smooth. Design the demo to elicit self-generated insights rather than forced conclusions. After showing a capability, ask open-ended questions that require the prospect to articulate the benefit. How would this feature impact your team's weekly meetings? The question forces the brain to retrieve personal relevance, strengthening the memory trace of the solution's value. When they voice the advantage, you're co-creating the case for purchase, which aligns with the commitment consistency principle and makes the eventual yes feel self-directed. Address any implied objections before they can solidify. The threat system is triggered by uncertainty about costs, implementation time, or potential failure. While showing the platform, surface those concerns proactively. The initial data import typically takes a single afternoon, and we have templates that match your current spreadsheet structure. By answering unknowns early, you reduce the mental load on the prospect's critical thinking brain, freeing it to focus on the solution's strengths. Use contrast to highlight unique differentiators without degrading competitors. Neuroscience shows that people evaluate options relative to alternatives, so a brief, neutral comparison can sharpen the perception of value. For example, after demonstrating a custom reporting feature, you might say, traditional tools require you to export data and build charts manually. Here the report updates automatically. The comparison is factual and respectful, allowing the prospect to see the benefit without feeling pressured. Turn the demo into a collaborative experience by inviting the prospect to co-design the final output. Ask them to choose which metrics they want highlighted on the dashboard. If you could see only 3 numbers at a glance, which would they be? When they select the metrics, they start shaping the solution to their specific needs, which activates the brain's sense of ownership. This mental handoff makes the final purchase feel like completing a project they already helped design. Leverage the Zeigarnik effect to keep the solution active in the prospect's mind after the demo ends. End the presentation by identifying one unresolved question that you will address in a follow-up. I noticed you asked about integrating with your accounting system. Let's explore that option together next week. The lingering open loop creates a mild tension that encourages them to stay engaged and seek resolution, naturally leading to another conversation where the ask can be made. Maintain ethical transparency throughout the demonstration. Neuroscientific studies show that people can sense insincerity at an unconscious level. Hidden agendas, exaggerated claims, or staged results trigger skepticism that undermines trust. Share real user data, show actual implementation timelines, and admit any limitations honestly. When you say the beta version still lacks the API connector, which we're slated to add in the next release, you preserve credibility and keep the threat system from firing. Conclude the demo by summarizing the journey you've taken together. Recap the key moments, the pain point you validated, the future state you visualized, the actions they performed, and the insight they voiced. Use simple language. You saw how this can replace manual tracking. You clicked through the workflow, and you identified the 3 metrics that matter most to your team. This recap reinforces memory anchors and makes the final ask feel like the logical next step. Make the closing move permission-based and low pressure. Instead of forcing a binary decision, offer clear next steps that preserve autonomy. Would you like me to send you a brief implementation guide so you can explore the pilot with your team? Or would you prefer to schedule a short walkthrough with your stakeholders? By giving 2 positive options, you maintain forward momentum while honoring their decision-making space. Cultural nuances influence how prospects experience demos. In collectivist cultures, inviting a group member to participate during the demonstration can increase social validation and reduce perceived risk. In more individualist settings, emphasize personal achievement and direct control. Adjust the language and interaction style accordingly, but keep the core neurological principles, safety, curiosity, ownership, intact. Digital demos require extra attention to fluency and engagement. Video calls strip away many visual cues, so compensate with higher vocal energy, clear framing, and frequent pauses for feedback. Use screen sharing tools that allow the prospect to point out sections, which restores the sense of active participation. When the technology fails, acknowledge it quickly, switch to a backup, and maintain the collaborative tone so the threat system does not engage. Finally, treat the demo as a living experiment. After each presentation, note which parts generated the strongest engagement, which questions sparked self-generated insights, and which follow-up steps led to conversion. Iterate on the script, the pacing, and the interactive moments. The brain learns from experience, and so will you. Each refined demo deepens the prospect's sense of ownership while reducing the need for overt persuasion. Show the value first and let the brain anticipate the outcome. Invite the prospect to act, no matter how small the gesture, to trigger reward pathways. Structure the walkthrough in clear segments and pause for summary to respect working memory limits. Use open-ended questions to surface personal relevance and strengthen memory. Close with permission-based next steps that preserve autonomy while keeping momentum toward a decision. Chapter 9. Objection Handling through Reframing. Objections feel like walls that block your path to the sale, but neuroscience reveals they're actually signals that the brain is trying to protect something important. When someone raises an objection, their amygdala has detected a potential threat to safety, status, or autonomy. Traditional sales training teaches you to overcome these walls through logic and persistence, but this approach triggers deeper defensive responses that create harder barriers. Reframing works differently by addressing the underlying concern while transforming the objection into a pathway toward decision. Every objection contains a seed of truth about what matters to the prospect. "It's too expensive" might really mean, "I need to understand the value before I can justify this." "We need to think about it" might really mean, "This feels risky, and I need more information to feel confident." "We're happy with our current solution" might really mean, "Change feels threatening, and I'm not sure the benefits outweigh the risks." When you reframe rather than fight, you help them explore the real concern behind the surface objection. The threat system that creates objections operates below conscious awareness, which means prospects often don't realize why they feel resistant. They experience vague discomfort that translates into verbal resistance, then rationalize that resistance with logical-sounding reasons. When you address only the rational surface reason, the emotional threat remains active and continues blocking progress. Reframing works by acknowledging the emotional truth while redirecting attention toward possibilities that feel safer. Reframing differs fundamentally from objection handling because it changes the context rather than defending against the concern. Instead of arguing about whether the price is reasonable, you reframe price as an investment in specific outcomes they care about. Instead of pushing them to make faster decisions, you reframe timing as giving them more time to evaluate thoroughly. This approach satisfies the brain's need for safety while moving the conversation forward. The cognitive reappraisal process explains why reframing works so effectively. When you help prospects see their situation from a different angle, their brain literally rewires the emotional response to the original concern. What felt threatening before suddenly feels manageable or even advantageous. This neurological shift happens because reframing engages the prefrontal cortex in reinterpreting the situation, which gives the amygdala permission to relax its defensive stance. Time-based reframing helps prospects see your solution within their natural planning cycles instead of forcing decisions on arbitrary timelines. "This quarter gives us enough time to implement properly" reframes urgency from pressure to opportunity. Taking an extra week to evaluate the details shows thorough leadership, reframes delay as wisdom rather than indecision. This temporal reframing removes artificial pressure while keeping conversations productive. Value reframing transforms price objections by connecting cost to specific benefits that match their priorities. Instead of defending a price point, help them calculate the value they would receive in their specific context. Over the next year, this saves your team 15 hours weekly, which at your team's hourly rate means this pays for itself in the first month, connects cost to savings they can visualize. This reframing shifts the conversation from expense to return on investment. Risk reframing helps prospects evaluate your solution against the greater risk of maintaining their current situation. "What's the cost of continuing with your current approach?" reframes their choice from taking a risk to avoiding one. This perspective shift often reveals that staying put carries higher risk than making a change, especially when the current situation includes known problems they want to solve. Capability reframing addresses "we don't have the resources" objections by connecting your solution to resources they already possess. The implementation process is designed for teams your size, and we provide training that gets your people up to speed quickly. Reframes resource constraints as manageable challenges rather than disqualifying factors. This reframing helps them see themselves as capable of success with your solution. Comparison reframing works by helping prospects evaluate your solution against relevant alternatives rather than perfect solutions that don't exist. When you compare this to continuing with your current manual process, the efficiency gains become clear. Reframes their decision framework to focus on realistic options. This approach prevents them from getting stuck evaluating against idealized alternatives that don't match reality. Partnership reframing transforms sales conversations from vendor relationships to collaborative problem solving. Let's explore how this could work within your team's existing strengths and preferences. Frames you as an ally who adapts to their needs rather than a vendor who expects them to adapt. This reframing reduces threat responses because partnership feels safer than transaction. Learning reframing turns implementation concerns into growth opportunities that align with their professional development goals. The training process builds capabilities your team will use in future projects, reframes the learning curve as investment in their professional growth. This perspective makes the challenge of learning something new feel valuable rather than burdensome. Success reframing helps prospects imagine the positive outcomes they want rather than just avoiding problems. Imagine having this challenge solved by next quarter creates vivid mental simulation of the benefits they desire. When they can clearly visualize positive outcomes, objections to the process of achieving those outcomes often become less threatening. The paradox of choice explains why prospects often feel overwhelmed by the decision-making process and retreat into objections. Too many options or too much information triggers decision paralysis. Reframing simplifies choices by focusing attention on the most relevant factors for their specific situation. This cognitive relief often makes them more willing to engage with your solution. Social validation reframing helps prospects see how others similar to them have successfully made similar decisions. Teams in your situation found that starting with a pilot program gave them confidence to expand, provides social proof without pressure. This reframing leverages their natural tendency to learn from others' experiences while maintaining their sense of individual choice. The sunk cost fallacy that keeps people stuck in bad situations can be reversed through reframing. The investment you've already made in your current approach doesn't have to be wasted, because you can apply those learnings to make this transition even more successful. Reframes their past investment as valuable preparation rather than something that would be lost by changing course. Creative reframing helps prospects see their challenge as an opportunity for innovation rather than just a problem to solve. This gives you a chance to redesign that process in a way that serves your team better, transforms obstacles into chances for improvement. This perspective shift makes the change feel like progress rather than disruption. Context reframing helps prospects see your solution within their larger business environment rather than as an isolated purchase. This connects to the systems you're already using and supports the growth plans your team discussed last quarter, places your solution within their existing ecosystem. This broader context makes the decision feel more natural and less threatening. The timing of reframing matters because objections often represent temporary emotional responses rather than permanent positions. When prospects raise objections during high-stress moments, reframing works better when you acknowledge the objection briefly, then help them explore it from a new angle when they're more relaxed. This timing respects their emotional state while maintaining forward momentum. Reframing requires genuine curiosity about their concerns because obvious manipulation triggers deeper skepticism. Your willingness to understand their perspective and help them think through alternatives shows respect for their intelligence and decision-making process. This respectful approach often transforms adversarial conversations into collaborative problem-solving sessions. The language you use during reframing either increases or decreases threat responses. Words like actually, however, or but signal disagreement that triggers defensiveness. Words like and, also, in addition, to signal continuation that feels safer. Choosing language that maintains connection while shifting perspective helps keep their brain in learning mode rather than defensive mode. Cultural differences affect how prospects prefer to have their objections reframed. Some cultures value direct logical approaches, while others prefer indirect, relationship-oriented reframing. Understanding these cultural preferences helps you choose reframing techniques that feel respectful rather than manipulative within their cultural context. Remember that reframing works best when you've established genuine understanding and value throughout the conversation. Objection reframing becomes much easier when prospects already see you as someone who understands their situation and wants to help them succeed. The relationship foundation makes the reframing feel like genuine assistance rather than sales tactics. As you practice reframing techniques, Notice how prospects' body language and engagement change when you acknowledge their concerns while exploring new perspectives. The most effective reframing happens when you genuinely want them to make the best decision for their situation, even if that means deciding against your solution. This authentic concern often leads to stronger relationships and better outcomes for everyone involved. A sales representative who typically fought every price objection discovered that when she reframed cost conversations around specific value her client valued most deeply. The same client who had said it's too expensive became one of her most enthusiastic advocates by the end of the conversation. The objection wasn't really about money at all. It was about understanding why the investment made sense for their specific situation. Chapter 10. Social Proof Without Pressure. Human brains evolved to rely on social cues for survival decisions, and this ancient wiring still influences how people evaluate new information today. When prospects see others like themselves succeeding with your solution, their brain treats this as valuable evidence that reduces perceived risk. The challenge lies in presenting social proof in ways that support their decision-making process, rather than manipulate them into choices they might later regret. Understanding how to use social proof ethically transforms it from a sales trick into a collaborative tool that helps prospects make confident decisions. The conformity principle discovered by Solomon Asch shows that people often change their behavior to match others, even when they privately disagree. This happens because social consensus signals safety and reduces the cognitive load required for individual decision-making. When prospects see that similar companies or individuals have chosen your solution, their brain interprets this consensus as evidence that the decision is reasonable and low risk. This neurological shortcut can help prospects feel confident about choices that might otherwise feel uncertain. Authority signals work through a different mechanism where the brain treats credible experts as reliable sources of information about complex topics. When prospects learn that respected industry leaders or technical experts recommend your approach, their brain reduces the mental energy required to evaluate the solution themselves. This authority-based decision-making happens automatically and creates confidence without the need for extensive technical evaluation. Social proof becomes problematic when it manipulates rather than informs. But the line between helpful guidance and psychological pressure depends largely on how you present the information. Ethical social proof presents factual evidence that prospects can evaluate independently, while manipulative social proof creates artificial urgency or false consensus that distorts the decision-making process. The difference lies in whether you're helping them make better decisions or pushing them toward outcomes they wouldn't choose if fully aware. Testimonials work best when they feel authentic and specific rather than polished and generic. Prospects can unconsciously detect when testimonials feel scripted or exaggerated, which triggers skepticism that destroys rather than builds trust. The most effective testimonials include realistic challenges, honest implementation experiences, and specific outcomes that prospects can evaluate against their own situation. These authentic stories create connection without feeling like marketing materials. Case studies provide the most credible form of social proof because they show detailed before and after scenarios that prospects can examine critically. Effective case studies demonstrate understanding of the prospect's specific challenges, show realistic implementation timelines, and present measurable outcomes that can be independently verified. When designed carefully, case studies serve as educational resources that help prospects understand possibilities without feeling pressured to make immediate decisions. Statistics about usage, satisfaction, or outcomes work when they provide relevant benchmarks rather than impressive-sounding numbers. Prospects care about how your solution performs in situations similar to theirs, not about overall market share or aggregate satisfaction scores. Specific metrics, like teams your size report 40% time savings, feel more credible and relevant than thousands of customers love our product. Relevance beats magnitude in social proof effectiveness. Peer behavior evidence works when it shows what similar organizations actually do rather than what marketing materials claim they do. Information about implementation rates, renewal percentages, or referral patterns provides social proof that prospects can verify through independent research. This observable behavior carries more weight than promotional claims because it reflects actual decisions rather than marketing messages. Industry recognition through awards, certifications, or expert recommendations works because it leverages established authority structures that prospects already trust. However, these signals must remain factual and verifiable rather than padded with marketing language that feels promotional. Simple statements about recognized achievements allow prospects to research and validate the claims independently, which creates stronger confidence than detailed promotional descriptions. The timing of social proof matters enormously because presenting it too early feels like marketing manipulation, while presenting it too late misses the opportunity to reduce risk and build confidence. The optimal timing varies by conversation, but social proof often works best after you've established understanding of their challenges and shown how your solution addresses those specific issues. At that point, social proof validates the approach rather than introducing it. Context matters as much as content when presenting social proof because prospects need to see relevance before they can evaluate credibility. Generic success stories feel less compelling than specific examples that match their industry, company size, or challenge type. The most effective social proof helps prospects see themselves in the story rather than treating it as information about someone else's situation. Language patterns that present social proof effectively avoid pressure words that trigger threat responses and instead use descriptive language that allows independent evaluation. Saying companies your size found this reduced their implementation time by half presents social proof without pressure. Adding, and you should act now to get the same results, transforms helpful information into manipulation that triggers resistance. The presentation format of social proof influences how prospects process and evaluate it. Visual formats like charts, graphs, or infographics often work better than text descriptions because they allow quick pattern recognition that feels objective. However, the visuals must remain honest and accurate rather than manipulated to create impressive-looking results that don't reflect reality. Online reviews and ratings provide social proof that prospects can verify independently, which creates stronger confidence than claims you make yourself. However, these reviews must be genuine and representative rather than selectively presented or artificially inflated. The ability to check your claims through independent research makes social proof much more credible than promotional materials. Group behavior social proof works by showing how others in their network have approached similar decisions. Other companies in your industry typically start with a pilot program, provide social proof that helps them understand normal decision patterns. This information reduces anxiety about making the right choice by showing them what successful peers have done. Cultural considerations affect how prospects respond to different types of social proof because various societies assign different levels of trust to expert authority versus peer consensus versus individual decision-making. Researching cultural preferences before important conversations helps you choose social proof types that feel credible rather than suspicious within their cultural context. Long-term relationship social proof involves showing how your current customers continue to expand their relationship with your company over time. Renewal rates, upgrade patterns, or referral behaviors provide evidence that your solution creates ongoing value rather than just initial satisfaction. This longitudinal social proof often feels more credible than initial success stories because it shows sustained positive outcomes. The key to ethical social proof lies in helping prospects make better decisions rather than just pushing them toward decisions you want them to make. This means presenting evidence that they would find valuable even if it led them to choose a different solution. When your social proof genuinely serves their interests, it builds trust rather than manipulation, creating stronger relationships that generate referrals and repeat business. Remember that social proof works by reducing perceived risk and building confidence, but it should never substitute for thorough evaluation of whether your solution truly fits their needs. The most effective use of social proof helps prospects see possibilities and reduce anxiety while maintaining their autonomy to make independent decisions based on their specific circumstances and priorities. Digital social proof requires extra attention to authenticity because online reviews, ratings, and testimonials can be easily manipulated or fabricated. Legitimate social proof comes from verifiable sources that prospects can research independently. Fake social proof eventually gets discovered and destroys both immediate opportunities and long-term credibility in ways that damage entire business relationships. Think about the last time you made an important decision after seeing social proof. What made that evidence feel credible versus pushy? What would have helped you evaluate the information more effectively? How could the presentation of social proof have supported better decision-making while still providing the confidence you needed to act? Imagine encountering social proof that feels so authentic and relevant that you want to learn more about the solution it describes, rather than feeling like you're being marketed to. Picture yourself reviewing case studies that teach you something valuable about solving challenges similar to yours, even if you ultimately choose a different approach. Chapter 11. The Future Self Technique. Every decision you make exists in the gap between who you are today and who you want to become tomorrow. Neuroscience reveals that this temporal bridge gets built through mental time travel that allows the brain to simulate future experiences before they happen. When prospects can vividly imagine themselves having successfully implemented your solution, their brain treats that future reality as more concrete and achievable. The Future Self technique taps into this natural neurological process to help prospects experience the benefits of your solution before committing to it. Mental time travel happens through what researchers call episodic future thinking that allows people to simulate specific future experiences with remarkable detail and emotional realism. When you guide prospects through imagining themselves using your solution, their brain activates the same neural networks as if the experience were actually happening. This neurological simulation makes abstract benefits feel tangible and future outcomes feel real, which reduces the perceived risk of taking action. The temporal self-continuity effect shows that people become more willing to invest in their future when they can maintain a sense of connection between their current and future selves. When prospects feel disconnected from their future self, they prioritize immediate concerns over long-term benefits. The Future Self technique strengthens this connection by helping them experience positive future outcomes, as if they were happening today. Episodic simulation involves creating detailed mental movies of future experiences that include specific sensory details, emotional responses, and environmental contexts. The brain processes these simulated experiences through the same neural circuits that handle actual memories, which makes them feel real and compelling. When prospects can mentally try on the experience of having their challenge solved, they develop genuine desire to make that simulation become reality. Temporal framing works by emphasizing different time horizons that make your solution feel more relevant to their current planning and priorities. Near-term framing focuses on immediate benefits and quick wins that reduce current stress. Mid-term framing connects your solution to upcoming projects, budget cycles, or strategic initiatives. Long-term framing emphasizes outcomes that align with their career goals and legacy planning. The concreteness principle in future thinking states that specific, vivid simulations feel more real and motivating than abstract or general future planning. Instead of saying this will improve your efficiency, guide them to imagine exactly how their Thursday afternoon meeting will feel different when they can generate reports in minutes instead of hours. Specific details make the future feel achievable rather than theoretical. Emotional anchoring to future outcomes helps prospects feel emotionally connected to the positive changes your solution will create. When they can imagine the relief of not worrying about deadline pressure, the satisfaction of delivering impressive results to their boss, or the pride of solving a persistent problem, they develop emotional motivation that supports rational decision-making. This emotional investment makes them more willing to invest time and resources in the solution. Visualization techniques work best when they engage multiple senses rather than just visual imagery. Help prospects not just see, but also hear, feel, and even smell their future success. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of closing your laptop at 5 p.m. knowing all reports are complete. Engages multiple sensory channels that strengthen the mental simulation and make it feel more real. Counterfactual thinking involves helping prospects imagine how their future might unfold differently depending on the decisions they make today. Picture yourself in 6 months having solved this challenge versus still struggling with the same problems. Creates mental contrast that makes taking action feel more compelling. This technique works because the brain evaluates options relative to alternatives rather than in isolation. Implementation intentions bridge the gap between future visualization and present action by helping prospects plan specific steps toward achieving their desired future state. If we implement this by the end of next month, then you'll be able to present the quarterly results without the stress you've been feeling. Helps them see concrete pathways from current situation to future success. Temporal distance affects how people think about future outcomes, with closer time horizons feeling more concrete and motivating than distant ones. The most effective future self technique adapts the time frame to match what feels psychologically reachable for each prospect. Some people respond better to quarterly outcomes, while others connect more strongly with multi-year strategic results. Goal visualization works when it helps prospects see not just the end state, but the journey of achieving it, including the challenges they'll overcome and the growth they'll experience along the way. This process visualization makes success feel more realistic and creates anticipation that supports commitment to the implementation process. Identity-based future thinking helps prospects see how using your solution aligns with who they want to become as professionals and leaders. Imagine being known as the person who transformed how your team handles complex projects, connects your solution to their professional identity and aspirations. This identity alignment makes adoption feel like natural evolution rather than forced change. Social future thinking involves helping prospects imagine how their success with your solution will affect their relationships with colleagues, managers, and stakeholders. Picture the respect you'll earn from your team when you deliver ahead of schedule. Leverages their social motivation to support decision-making. This technique works because social standing matters deeply to most people's sense of self-worth. Stress reduction visualization helps prospects imagine the emotional relief they'll experience when persistent challenges get resolved. Think about how much lighter your stress will feel during busy seasons. Targets their emotional motivation directly. This emotional reframing often proves more compelling than logical arguments because emotions drive more decisions than pure logic. Capability expansion visualization helps prospects see your solution as a tool for professional growth rather than just problem solving. Imagine having this capability that opens doors for the project you want to tackle next year, positions your solution as an investment in their future opportunities. This growth perspective makes the decision feel proactive rather than reactive. Team impact visualization helps prospects see how their success with your solution will benefit the people they lead or work with. Picture your team feeling confident about meeting deadlines instead of constantly stressed. Appeals to their care for others and desire to create positive work environments. This social motivation often strengthens commitment to implementation. Risk mitigation future thinking helps prospects imagine the problems they'll avoid by taking action rather than just the benefits they'll gain. Imagine not having to work late during crunch time anymore. Focuses on relief from negative experiences rather than just acquisition of positive ones. This reframing often proves more motivating because people are more motivated to avoid pain than to pursue pleasure. Cultural considerations matter in future thinking because different societies have varying relationships with temporal planning and individual versus collective future orientation. Some cultures emphasize long-term planning and future benefits, while others prioritize immediate results and present circumstances. Understanding these cultural differences helps you choose future self techniques that feel natural rather than foreign. Digital future visualization requires attention to the medium's limitations in creating rich sensory experiences. Video calls can support visual and auditory simulation, but phone conversations need extra attention to verbal imagery and emotional language. Written materials should include vivid language that helps readers mentally simulate future experiences despite the medium's constraints. The validation of future experiences happens when prospects share their mental simulations with colleagues or decision-makers. When they can articulate their vision of future success clearly and compellingly, they often discover deeper commitment to making that vision reality. This social validation process strengthens their connection to the future self who has solved their challenges. Remember that future thinking works best when it helps prospects make better decisions rather than just pushing them toward choices you prefer. The most ethical future self technique guides them to consider positive outcomes they genuinely want, even if those outcomes sometimes lead them to choose alternatives to your solution. This approach builds trust while serving their long-term interests. Integration with other techniques enhances the future self technique's effectiveness because combining temporal visualization with memory anchors, social proof, or permission-based closing creates multiple pathways to commitment. When prospects can vividly imagine their future success, remember previous conversations about your solution, and feel social validation for their choice, they develop strong motivation to move forward confidently. The practical application of future self technique requires careful attention to timing, language, and emotional authenticity. Guide prospects through future simulations naturally rather than forcing them through artificial mental exercises. The most effective future thinking happens when prospects feel genuinely curious about possibilities rather than being guided through predetermined outcomes. Practice future self techniques in low-stakes situations to develop sensitivity for when and how they work most effectively. Notice which types of future scenarios feel most compelling to different people and which temporal frameworks create the strongest emotional connection. This awareness builds the intuitive skill needed to help prospects connect with their future success authentically. This chapter's goal is to help prospects experience the positive future they want rather than just imagine abstract benefits. When they can genuinely see themselves having solved their challenges and achieving their goals, making decisions that support that future becomes more natural and confident. The future self technique transforms distant possibilities into compelling realities that motivate present action. Create a vivid mental simulation of your prospect's ideal future state with your solution implemented. Then help them articulate what that success would feel like and look like in concrete terms. Chapter 12. Integration and Ethical Boundaries. The 12 persuasion techniques you've learned work most powerfully when integrated into a natural, relationship-first approach rather than applied as isolated sales tactics. Each technique builds on the others to create conversations that flow smoothly from connection through understanding to confident decisions. However, this integration requires clear ethical boundaries that protect trust while maximizing positive outcomes. Understanding how to combine these methods responsibly ensures they serve both immediate goals and long-term relationship health. The foundation of effective integration lies in sequencing techniques appropriately throughout the relationship lifecycle. Early conversations should prioritize trust building through the trust equation and language that calms the critic. Middle stage interactions benefit from value priming, memory anchors, and fluency triggers that help prospects understand and remember your solution. Later stages use permission-based closing, social proof, and future self techniques that support confident decisions. This progression creates natural flow rather than forced manipulation. The persuasion switch remains the entry point for every interaction because threat responses can still override all other techniques when activated. Start each conversation by establishing psychological safety through validation and understanding. Only after you sense the switch has opened should you introduce priming, demonstrations, or complex information. This sequencing respects the brain's natural information processing requirements while keeping the relationship foundation strong. Value priming works best when combined with memory anchors because prepared minds retain information more effectively. Prime for curiosity about specific outcomes, then help prospects encode those benefits through vivid examples and mental simulations. This combination creates both immediate engagement and long-term retention that supports their decision-making process over time. The same information gets processed more thoroughly when presented in this integrated sequence. Memory anchors become more powerful when connected to fluency techniques that make complex information feel approachable. Use familiar metaphors to help prospects visualize how your solution works. Then reinforce those images through strategic repetition and visual aids. This combination makes sophisticated concepts feel simple without sacrificing accuracy or completeness. Prospects remember and understand better when cognitive ease supports deep processing. The trust equation strengthens every other technique because people evaluate information through trust filters. When mirror neurons fire strongly, prospects mirror your confidence about future outcomes. When oxytocin flows through positive bonding, they seek your input on decisions. When predictability creates safety, they engage more fully with demonstrations and explanations. Trust amplifies all influence techniques while preserving autonomy. Social proof becomes more credible when delivered through permission-based language that respects individual decision-making. Instead of saying everyone else is doing this, use others in your situation found this approach helpful, while giving them space to evaluate whether the evidence applies to their circumstances. This integration preserves the helpful nature of social proof while preventing pressure responses that close down exploration. Objection handling through reframing works best when combined with future self techniques that help prospects imagine positive outcomes. When they express concerns, acknowledge those concerns while helping them visualize how your solution addresses those issues in their future success story. This combination validates their caution while moving them toward solutions. Reframing without future vision feels incomplete, while future thinking without addressing concerns feels dismissive. Closing becomes more natural when built on the foundation of all previous techniques. Permission-based questions feel organic after genuine curiosity, concrete demonstrations, and clear value articulation. When prospects have experienced safety, understanding, and possibility, asking for commitment to next steps feels like collaboration rather than pressure. Integrated closing represents the logical conclusion of a helpful process rather than a separate sales tactic. The ethical boundaries that govern this integration focus on three key principles: autonomy preservation, benefit alignment, and transparency maintenance. Autonomy preservation means every technique must increase rather than decrease the prospect's sense of control over their own decisions. Benefit alignment means your influence should support outcomes that genuinely serve their interests. Transparency means your methods should remain honest and verifiable rather than manipulative or deceptive. The autonomy preservation test asks whether each technique helps prospects think more clearly and make better decisions independently. If a technique would work less well if the prospect knew exactly what you were doing, it likely crosses ethical boundaries. Helpful influence reveals itself through better thinking and clearer decisions, while manipulative influence becomes less effective when exposed. The benefit alignment test evaluates whether your influence serves their interests or just yours. When your techniques help prospects solve genuine problems, build capabilities they value, or achieve outcomes they desire, the influence remains ethical. When your methods push them toward decisions primarily serving your interests, manipulation begins. The line exists where their interests and yours diverge significantly. The transparency test examines whether you could comfortably explain your methods if asked directly. Ethical influence techniques remain valid when disclosed openly, while manipulative tactics become questionable when exposed. This transparency test protects both the prospect's ability to make informed choices and your long-term credibility and relationships. Cultural adaptation requires sensitivity to different norms around influence and persuasion while maintaining core ethical principles. Some cultures prefer indirect communication patterns, while others value direct approaches. Some emphasize collective decision-making, while others prioritize individual choice. Adapting techniques to cultural expectations shows respect while preserving the fundamental commitment to autonomy and benefit alignment. Long-term relationship focus transforms short-term techniques into sustainable business practices. When you consistently prioritize understanding before selling, prospects learn to trust your communication style and seek your input on decisions. This trust compounds over time, creating opportunities for larger projects, referrals, and strategic partnerships that benefit everyone involved. Ethical influence builds business rather than just closing individual transactions. Implementation requires systematic practice that starts with low-stakes situations and gradually builds skill across more complex scenarios. Begin by integrating 2 or 3 techniques in conversations that matter less. Then expand to full integration as comfort and skill develop. The goal becomes internalizing these patterns until they feel natural rather than forced. Authentic integration creates better outcomes because it matches your genuine desire to help people solve problems. Digital integration requires adaptation to virtual communication environments while preserving core neurological principles. Video calls support mirror neuron activation and visual demonstrations, but require extra attention to vocal warmth and environmental preparation. Phone conversations need enhanced emotional language and permission-based questions to compensate for missing visual cues. Written communication demands careful attention to tone and clarity to maintain ethical boundaries. The sustainability question examines whether these techniques support your long-term success and well-being. Techniques that feel manipulative create stress and damage relationships, while ethical influence creates satisfaction and strengthens connections. Choose methods that you can use confidently over years without compromising your values or damaging your reputation. Sustainable influence serves both immediate goals and long-term character. Personal boundaries matter because you cannot give what you don't have. Emotional exhaustion, time pressure, or stress reduces your capacity to use these techniques effectively and ethically. Maintain practices that keep you energized and authentic, because depleted or pressured communicators struggle to preserve ethical boundaries. Your well-being directly impacts your ability to influence ethically. Integration success happens when prospects describe their experience as helpful rather than sold. They feel heard, understood, and supported rather than manipulated or pressured. Their decisions feel confident and right for their situation rather than influenced by psychological techniques. This outcome creates the foundation for referral generation, repeat business, and long-term relationship success that makes ethical influence sustainable. The most powerful integration occurs when these techniques become invisible because they match your authentic communication style. Prospects experience you as genuinely helpful rather than skilled at manipulation. This authenticity creates the strongest possible foundation for influence because people trust natural behavior more than performed techniques. The ultimate goal involves becoming someone who naturally helps others solve problems effectively. Your ethical compass should guide decisions about when and how to use these techniques, especially in situations that feel ambiguous or challenging. When in doubt, choose approaches that preserve autonomy and prioritize their interests. This ethical foundation ensures that your influence strengthens rather than damages the relationships that support your long-term success. Monitor the relationship impact of your influence techniques by paying attention to how prospects describe their experience and whether they seek continued interaction. Healthy influence creates stronger relationships, while manipulation damages them. This feedback loop provides ongoing guidance about whether your integration methods remain ethical and effective. Ask whether each technique increases or decreases the prospect's autonomy before applying it. Verify that your influence serves their interests, as well as your own, before proceeding. Choose methods you would be comfortable explaining if asked directly about your approach. Adapt techniques to cultural expectations while preserving core ethical principles. Evaluate relationship outcomes to ensure your influence builds rather than damages trust. Epilogue. Beyond sales. These techniques began as tools for business conversations, but their power extends far deeper into how you connect, lead, and create change in every area of your life. When you understand how the brain processes information, makes decisions, and builds relationships, you gain access to ethical influence that transforms interactions from transactional exchanges into collaborative growth experiences. The principles in this book become a framework for conscious communication that serves everyone involved. Leadership transformation happens naturally when you apply these methods to team interactions. Instead of managing through control and compliance, you learn to activate engagement through psychological safety and genuine curiosity. Managers who use these techniques find their teams become more innovative, productive, and loyal because people feel heard, valued, and empowered to contribute their best thinking. Influence through understanding creates stronger organizations than influence through authority. Parent-child relationships improve dramatically when you shift from telling to engaging young minds in their own learning process. Rather than fighting resistance, you learn to prime curiosity and frame challenges as opportunities for growth. Children respond better to collaborative problem-solving than to directives, and these techniques provide practical scripts for those daily conversations. The same patterns that make prospects comfortable make families function more harmoniously. Friend and family connections strengthen when you apply trust equation principles to personal relationships. Mirror neurons fire strongly when you genuinely reflect others' perspectives back to them. Oxytocin release happens naturally when people feel understood and valued rather than judged or dismissed. Predictability through consistent emotional availability creates the security that allows deep relationships to flourish. These skills spill over from sales conversations into every meaningful connection. Professional networking evolves from awkward self-promotion into genuine relationship building when you use permission-based approaches. Instead of networking, you are building trust through value creation, which feels authentic and sustainable. Colleagues and potential collaborators respond positively to curiosity about their work and challenges rather than to requests for favors or introductions. Your reputation for helpful influence becomes your most powerful career asset. Conflict resolution becomes more effective when you recognize threat responses and use reframing techniques to address underlying concerns rather than surface disagreements. Instead of defending positions, you learn to validate perspectives while exploring mutually beneficial solutions. The same brain-based understanding that transforms sales objections helps navigate family disagreements, workplace conflicts, and community challenges with less friction and more creativity. Personal goal achievement accelerates when you apply future self techniques to your own planning and motivation. Mental simulation of achieving meaningful objectives activates the same neural networks that drive action toward those outcomes. Memory anchors help you stay focused on priorities, while fluency techniques make complex plans feel manageable. The systems you use to help others succeed become frameworks for creating your own success. Community engagement benefits when leaders apply these principles to inspire collective action. Instead of pushing agendas, they prime shared values, validate concerns, and build trust through consistent communication. Social proof becomes evidence of what's possible rather than pressure to conform. The most effective movements inspire people to choose participation rather than feeling coerced into compliance. The ripple effects of ethical influence extend beyond individual conversations into the cultural fabric of your workplace, family, and community. When you model respectful communication that honors autonomy while inspiring action, others learn these patterns through observation and practice. Small changes in how you speak and listen create larger shifts in how groups function and solve problems collectively. Personal growth becomes inevitable when you consistently apply these techniques because they require self-awareness and emotional intelligence. Learning to recognize threat responses in yourself and others develops your capacity for empathy and presence. The skills that make you influential also make you more fully human, connected, and capable of handling life's challenges with greater wisdom and effectiveness. The ethical commitment underlying all these techniques means using your understanding of neuroscience to serve others' growth and well-being, not just your own objectives. When influence serves mutual benefit, it strengthens rather than exploits connections. This approach creates sustainable relationships that generate opportunities, support, and shared success over the long term. You now possess tools that can transform how you show up in every important conversation. The choice lies in how consciously and consistently you apply these insights to serve both your goals and the well-being of everyone around you. Start small with the people closest to you. Practice with low-stakes interactions, and gradually expand your ethical influence to larger circles of impact. Remember that the most powerful persuasion happens when people feel genuinely heard, understood, and empowered to make their own best decisions. Your role becomes creating the conditions where this natural human process can unfold rather than trying to force outcomes through manipulation or pressure. This shift from control to service transforms not just your results, but your experience of meaningful work and relationships. The journey continues beyond this book, in every conversation where you choose understanding over advocacy, collaboration over competition, and service over self-interest. These choices, made consistently over time, create the legacy of ethical influence that makes the world more humane while achieving whatever goals matter to you. Copyright 2025 Lumen Audiobooks. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced or transmitted in any form without written permission from the author. Disclaimer: this book provides general information and is not professional advice. The author and publisher disclaim any liability arising from the use of this information. Consult qualified professionals for advice specific to your situation.